Alright, picking up where I left off. He said, I confess I began to wonder how I was going to work this formula into Sister of Democracy, Show Some Leg, or Maze Boy, how one man brought down the United States Postal Service. Now, there is another recipe, she said, which gave me hope that there might be a more compatible formula for one of my stories. First, she began, you must paint a picture of great personal misery. You must tell the reader of a time when you failed at something, when you had no control over a situation or dynamic. Second, you must talk about where you are now, how you have control over the situation or dynamic, and how wonderful and fulfilling it is to have control. Third, you must give the reader a 3 to 4 step plan for getting from the misery and lack of control to the joy and control you currently have. As wonderful as I thought this formula was, and I confess that I thought it was wonderful, once again, I felt that it was going to be difficult for me to wrap my story around one of these recipes. I thought perhaps there would be another formula, perhaps one with guns or a midnight parachute drop into a small African village, but there wasn't. It turned out there were only 2 formulas. I did this last time I recorded. I read it interactor instead of instructor, but it's on 2 different lines. But you can't. 2 different lines. I hate it when it does a line break like that. Okay, anyway, I'm ranting, so. I love you. Our instructor went on to tell us that during the next 2 days, for 8 hours each day, we were going to walk step by step through these 2 magical formulas. And by the end of our time, we were going to have them mastered. That essentially we were going to be able to approach any topic and hook the reader from the very first paragraph. I sat and listened attentively, taking copious notes, learning to look for the misery that is hiding beneath the surface of life, the misery that many people will not feel until you tell them it is there, and to identify the joy we now feel because the misery has been overcome by taking 3 steps, and how these 3 steps are very easy and can be taken by anybody who has $15 to spend on my book. When it came time for lunch, I let the room empty out except for our seminar instructor, and feeling defeated and confused because I didn't believe these formulas were necessarily compatible with my stories, I approached her and asked about how I might fit one of these formulas into a book about a nun with a machete. She looked over my shoulder into the empty room, tilted her head, then looked back into my eyes and asked whether I realized this was a non-fiction rather than a fiction seminar. At the time, I confess, I didn't know the difference between fiction and non-fiction. So, I slightly inquired about the delineation. What do you feel is the largest difference between a work of fiction and a work of non-fiction? And again, she looked at me confused. Well, she said, I suppose a non-fiction book would be true and a fiction book would be made up. For example, I said, motioning with my hand for an example. Well, she began, looking at the floor, smiling before looking back at me, kind of sighing as she spoke. A novel, a story like the one you're talking about, would be considered a fiction book. But a self-help book, the sort of book we are discussing at this seminar, would be considered non-fiction, because we aren't really making up stories so much as we're trying to offer advice. I see, I said, kind of looking at the ceiling. I get it, looking back at the floor. Indeed, I said, looking back at my instructor. Does that help, she asked, smiling and putting her hand on my arm. It does, I said. It helps a great deal. I like to get people's perspective on fiction and non-fiction. I find the various opinions intriguing. I am sure you do, she said to me after a long, uncomfortable pause. I ate lunch at the Denny's across the street from the hotel, feeling the entire trip to Memphis had been a mistake. And then I remembered a little song, something about making lemons from a lemon tree, and I realized that what I needed to do was write a non-fiction book, something that helped people who are miserable become happy. Only mine would be a Christian self-help book, and I would start each reading with scripture and then break down the formula the scripture spoke of. It would be called Devotions You Could Read While Eating Ice Cream, Soy Ice Cream, and so on. There is no question, I was the best student in the seminar. Women under 100 pounds lose energy in the late afternoons because they do not eat enough and they miss their families. I returned home and began poring over the Bible, looking for formulas I could use for my book of daily devotions. I have to tell you that this was much more difficult than you might think. The formulas, in fact, are hidden. It seemed that when God had the Bible put together, He hid a lot of the ancient wisdom. So basically, you have to read into things and even kind of make up things to get the formula to work out. And the formulas were obvious. And the formulas that were obvious are terrible. For instance, a guy named Stephen was miserable, or at least I assumed he was miserable, and then he became a Christian, and then he was stoned to death. This formula, of course, was not good enough to make the cut, and for that matter, neither was the one about Paul, who was a murderer before he became a Christian, and then was blinded while traveling, met Jesus in a burst of light, and then spent various painful years moving from city to city, prison to prison, routinely being beaten and bitten by snakes. No formula there. I moved on to Peter, who was rescued from a successful fishing business only to be crucified, some historical accounts claim, along with his wife. And of course, that wouldn't work, so I decided to ignore the actual characters of Scripture and just go with the teachings of Jesus. And that is when things really became difficult. Apparently, Jesus had not heard of the wonderful tool of acronym. He mostly told stories, some of which were outlandish. Step 1, eat my flesh. Step 2, drink my blood. Do you know what having to read something like that would do to a guy trying to process dairy products? Of course, I got frustrated, and it really got me thinking that perhaps formula books, by that I mean books that take you through a series of steps, may not be all that compatible with the Bible. I looked on my shelf at all the self-help books I had happened to own, the ones about losing weight, the ones about making girls like you, the ones about getting rich, and the ones about starting your own pirate radio station. And I realized that none of them actually helped me all that much. All the promises of fulfillment really didn't work. My life was fairly normal before I had read them, meaning I had good days and bad days, and then my life was fairly normal after I read them. After I read them too, meaning I still had good days and bad days. It made me wonder, honestly, if such a complex existence was the one you and I are living, can really be broken down into a few steps. It seems as if there were a formula to fix life, Jesus would have told us what it was. Alright, that's the end of that one. I hope it's not too long. Anyway, I love you, and I'll talk to you soon. I hope you're sleeping well.